listening to all of you speak, a phrase that we talk about in counseling just kept coming up for me. And I think all of us, all the counselors in the room probably have heard this before, but it's all behavior makes sense in context. And as I think about racial trauma, as I think about people's reaction to traumatic events that they may have experienced directly or indirectly, we have to begin to normalize the traumatic response that then comes from that, right? Instead of stigmatizing it and then labeling it as a personal problem. Oh, so-and-so is bad. They are not coping in the way that they should be coping. Or they're struggling mentally because perhaps they're, whatever it is, there's a negative connotation when we forget to consider full context of what's happening, right? So then if we take the time to do that, hopefully what we then begin to usher in is compassion and empathy, a cultural responsiveness, and also a nod to the structural components, the system that actually made it possible for these things to happen. And not only happen, I would say to keep happening, right? That's how we are stuck in this generational cycle where we're then now passing down our completely contextually and behaviorally appropriate responses to these events to our children and our children's children, right? In the example that Dr. Avent Harris gave, her father was reacting to an event that made sense, right? But I can imagine maybe for someone else, looking from the outside in, that response may have been overblown. They may have seen it as not disproportionate to what the experience was. But then when you begin to consider context, right, identity, experiences, but also you have to consider the system in which we have been steeped in. Outside of all those things, probably wouldn't make sense, but now we get it. And then what happens to your brother who's sitting there like, well, what? I'm just having fun with the neighbors and I don't understand. But now he's left trying to understand and make sense of that experience. There's so much that comes with that. And I can only imagine what that must have been like for him, trying to conceptualize that, making sense of it, rattling that around in his brain, and then perhaps moving forward, now beginning to question how he interacts with those neighbors. That's what we mean by generational trauma. That response that her father had was contextually appropriate. And so this is where coping comes in too, and why it's so important. So these are coping responses that then we're trying to create a facilitative reaction or response for us, right? We're protecting ourselves, protecting our children, protecting those that we care about, protecting maybe those that we are responsible for in our professional roles. And without the consideration of the whole context, none of it makes sense. But this is what this work is about. The encouragement of us all together to begin to look at restorative justice and begin to understand all of the systems, all of the behaviors, all of our experiences in context. If we fall into the trap of looking singularly at someone's actions or behaviors without that thing, then we miss the whole. We are in trouble in doing that. And I'll be quite honest, I think that too often that's what we as a whole in this country have done. Right? And that's what restorative justice is about. It's about accountability and beginning to repair harm that's been done, systemic harm. So and I think that the difficulty here is there's no wrong or right way to do this, I would say. I think that there are steps that typically restorative justice involves, but it can also represent empty action if you just follow the steps, right? And I think we've all been on the receiving end of someone perhaps, I'm just going to use this metaphor because I think it relates, but perhaps apologizing, but then you really knowing it's an empty apology. Yeah. So how do we create an environment? How do we create a system in which restorative justice can begin to happen, but meaningfully, not without empty promises, empty gestures, things that people just say to check off a list to say, okay, I've done it. Are you happy now? I don't think that's what anybody wants. We don't want the "are you happy now?" We want the meaningful action. So then that's what I hope that we can begin to talk about is, given some of the challenges within your own environments, perhaps where you work or your individual community, what would restorative justice look like? And how might that begin to occur?
Dr.